absorbing what she's saying. Be open. So not everyone is coming into this conversation at the same starting point or with the same experience. So especially when someone is speaking to their own experience, be open to what they're saying. Push through the growing edge. Again, we're not all coming to this conversation the same starting point. This will, for some people, feel very 101. For others, this may seem totally new. And that's okay, because we all have different lenses for this. Respectfully challenge each other. So not everyone has to agree. I don't think everyone should agree all the time. I think the world would be very boring, but we definitely want to make sure that we're respecting each other and respecting this conversation. Lean in and lean out. So that's really me saying, if you found yourself to not have participated in the chat or taken yourself off of mute yet, really push yourself to further engage in the conversation. And then if you feel like you may have been taking up too much space, or you may be taking up more space than you want, and you want to give others the opportunity to speak, please do that as well. And then the main one is to continue the conversation. As Umi said earlier, there's no point in having these workshops and having these trainings, having these regional meetings, if then the information is going to just stay with us or stay in here. And we want to make sure we're having these larger conversations, because it's ultimately going to impact Black survivors for the better. Next. 1 second, hold on. Shared workspaces. All right, so I have, before we really get going, I want to take a very intentional moment to recognize Black women throughout the diaspora. I want to recognize stolen African women whose blood courses through my veins, whose resilience and strength and skill and love has been passed down from generation to generation. I want to recognize Black women who've been told they're too strong or too undeserving to get help, but somehow still made it and somehow continue to still make it. So I'm gonna read a poem by Marie Evans. It's entitled, I Am a Black Woman, and then we'll continue on. I'm a Black woman. The music of my song, some sweet arpeggio of tears, is written in a minor key, and I can be heard humming in the night. I saw my mate leap screaming to the sea, and I with these hands cupped the life breath from my issue in the canebrake. I lost Nate's swinging body in a rain of tears, and heard my son scream all the way from Anzio for peace he never knew. I learned Da Nang and Pork Chop Hill in anguish. Now my nostrils know the gas, and these trigger-tired fingers seek the softness in my warrior's beard. I am a Black woman, tall as a cypress, strong, beyond all definition still, defying place and time and circumstance, assailed, impervious, indestructible. Look on me and be renewed. And so I always love presenting, you can go to the next slide, Sita. I always love presenting after Umi, because she does just an awesome job of laying the groundwork, laying down the language that we're gonna be using, framing out a lot of the conversation that we're gonna have. So we've talked about race, we've talked about ethnicity, we've talked about culture and how it shows up. We now talk about misogynoir and what that is. So misogynoir is a term that was coined by Black feminist scholar Moya Bailey in 2010 to describe the specific ways in which racism and misogyny combine to oppress Black women. So you can really think of it as the way misogyny and Black womanhood collide. But what does it look like? What does it mean? How does it show up? Anybody want to guess or give an example of how misogynoir shows up in our society? So misogynoir shows up in the ways that Don Imus in 2004 felt entitled enough to call the Black women on the Rutgers basketball team nappy-headed hoes on live radio. It shows up in the ways in which former First Lady Michelle Obama was attacked throughout still is attacked. She was called everything from ape-like to ghetto to mannish to classless, even though we know all of those things to be untrue, and even though she is the most educated First Lady we've had. What else? How else does it show up? What else is it? So if you don't have an answer, as we continue on, I think we'll get filled in with that. Next slide. So again, history is important. Historical implications really frame out the modern day setting for violence in Black women's lives. So we're going to go over a couple different examples. The concept of rape as it's been applied to Black women, the reality of slave rape and breeding farms, Sally Hemings' story, sexual terror and lynching during the Jim Crow eras and civil rights decades, birth control testing and forced sterilization, Centoya Brown's story, around the missing girls in DC, the violence experienced by sex workers or folks presumed to be sex workers, and then a little bit or just a smidge around labor, work, and the truth around government handouts. Oh, I see. Oh, Rose, let me read yours. Oh, hold on, it's not showing up for some reason. So Rose said, years of R. Kelly targeting Black girls without consequence, while those who targeted white women were focused in on. Absolutely. Says, I am thinking about how people responded when Serena Williams indicated assertiveness and criticized her. But had she been a white man, certainly she would have been revered for her response. Absolutely. And the fact that she's constantly drug tested far more than the other players. Come on now. So let's get into it. Next slide. So the reality of slave rape and breeding farms. And folks really don't know about this history, but it's very easy to find out if you do a quick Google search. The reality of slave rape was that it was pervasive. No Black woman or girl was exempt from either being raped or the constant threat of rape. A lot of people have pushed this narrative that if you were lighter skinned, you would have been better off during slavery because you would have been in the house compared to darker skinned folks who had been out in the field, when the reality is everyone was experiencing violence. And if you were in the home, you were just in that much closer proximity to your rapist. Breeding farms were specifically designed to perpetuate the business of slavery. On breeding farms, Black slaves were forced to have sex with whoever was available. Black slave women were expected to a lot of times maintain a quota of successful, good stock babies. So in a lot of cases, slave owners would say, if you bear me 15 children, good stock that I can sell, that I, as soon as they're born, they're going to be my property, that I can rape, I can beat, I can sell, bear 15 of those children, you might get your freedom. And when I say slave women were forced to have sex with whoever was available, that's exactly what I mean. Black mothers were a lot of times forced to have sex with several different slave men until they became pregnant. That could have included their brothers, cousins, uncles, their own male children. And so this is literally where the language of mother effer comes from. So when we think about histories of language, we see how violence is perpetuated in language as well. Next slide. Who's Sally Hemings? Someone tell me who she is. Have you heard of her? See some head nods.
She was, this is Cheryl, the mistress, if you will, to Thomas Jefferson. Not even mistress, she was the mother of all of his children in Monticello.
Thank you. And I love that you clarified that, because that's the narrative that's pushed forward a lot of times, that she was Thomas Jefferson's mistress or concubine. But the reality is that she was a child sex slave to a former sitting president. She was 14 when she began having his children. They have a range between 6 and 8 children, which to me that means 2 may have died, but had at least 6 of his children. She herself was the product of slave rape. Her mother had been raped by her master and bore several children. She was kept in a windowless brick room that was adjoining his bedroom. And she was eventually freed by one of her children after time served. So again, we see those lineages from the breeding farms happening. She was freed after time served, but only then lived another 9 years after she was free. So I think it's really important when we think about trauma and advocacy. We also have to think about historical trauma and how it's passed down from generation to generation to generation as well, because it's encoded in our DNA. And there's whole literature of how historical trauma is passed down in our DNA. I think I saw Greta that comment. Yes, thank you, Greta. So the Sally Hemings' mother was Thomas Jefferson's father-in-law. So again, we see how property and legacy was working there. Next. So sexual terror and lynching during the Jim Crow eras and civil rights decades. So of course, sexual terror didn't end when slavery ended. Rape has and continues to be used as a weapon of terror against the minds and bodies of Black folk, Black men and women alike. The rape of Black women by white men continued, going mostly unpunished throughout Jim Crow. As Reconstruction collapsed and Jim Crow took its place, white men abducted and raped or gang raped Black women with alarming regularity. White men would routinely lure Black women and girls from the home into their homes with the promise of steady work and reasonable pay, whether it was through them being a nanny or a maid, and then would rape them when they were in the home. White men would also regularly kidnap and rape women on their way to and from work, home, church, school, as really it was a way to reinforce the racial and economic hierarchies. So how I think of this era is as lynching was to Black men, rape was to Black women. Not to say that Black women weren't lynched, and not to say that Black men weren't raped or sexually violated, because that did happen as well. But we saw how sexual terror really manifested during this era. And there's a really amazing book by Danielle McGuire. It's entitled At the Dark End of the Street, that I would highly recommend if anybody wants to do more research into this or more reading into this era in particular. And then the case of Recy Taylor sticks out because I'll tell you why. So Advil native Recy Taylor was kidnapped and raped by 6 knife-wielding, gun-toting white men as she walked home from church on September 3rd, 1944. The NAACP actually assigned activist Rosa Parks to investigate the case, but the case never was allowed to go to trial because an all-white male grand jury refused to indict the men. So the Alabama legislature apologized for the miscarriage of justice in 2011. But her story you can find, I think it's still on Netflix, it may be on Hulu, but it's called The Rape of Recy Taylor, and it's a really, really powerful documentary. So I highly recommend it as well. Next slide. So birth control testing, forced sterilization, and Black maternal mortality rates. So what's thought of as one of the championing moments, and was one of the championing moments for women, for the women's rights movement, was access to birth control, and in particular, the pill. Approximately a third of women taking contraceptive measures rely on the pill, but most have no idea of its dark past. Before the pill was marketed and then distributed to white American women as a symbol of independence and bodily autonomy, it was tested on Black and brown women in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Native women, in psych wards, prisons, jails, and urban cities, and largely resulted in mass sterilization, birth defects, and other major reproductive issues. Many poor women of color were either coerced or forced into taking the pill or the Depo-Provera shot, and were prevented from stopping taking the medication despite experiencing severe bleeding, cramping, and even miscarriage. Many women delivered what were called jellyfish babies, who were born without bones and with very translucent skin. So it's really important to understand that even when something can be great and can be a great championing moment for some folks, there may be some dark history that we have to talk about for others. So the history of testing on Black women's bodies is why you'll sometimes hear folks in the Black community say things like birth control was Black genocide. They're taking a very small piece of that narrative or that story when really we need to be talking about reproductive justice and what that would mean for Black women. Next slide. So who is Cyntoia Brown? Somebody tell me who she is.
Cyntoia was, she was a young woman, I shouldn't even say woman, she was a child who was raped, basically in human sex trafficking. And when she killed the man who was raping her, she was sentenced, I think, to life in prison. And it wasn't until, was it last year, that she was granted clemency and she was able to get out. You can, she has also done some interviews. She's married now to a guy. She talks about her, what she went through, not only in prison, but what she went through before that too. And during her trial, they basically exploited her as a sex worker instead of a child who was, what is it called? A child who was, she was groomed. Mm-hmm. Instead of a child who was groomed by a white man at that to have sex with her. And this man, I think he was in the army, was he, at one point? Or he served some part of the U.S. military, I think, but I'm not sure.
That's great. Thank you so much. So exactly right. Cyntoia was 16 years old when she was charged and convicted as an adult, receiving a life sentence after she shot the John who had bought her for the night from her pimp named Cutthroat. I think that's really important to say. It wasn't just her out here willy-nilly deciding that she's going to traffic herself. Someone was trafficking her. She tried to explain that she killed the John because she was fearful that he was planning to murder her. But the district attorney the now district attorney of Madison, Georgia, contended that no, she was a willing participant, that she wasn't a victim of trafficking, and was instead a thief who conspired to rob a man and then murdered him. So exactly right. She had gone up for parole last year and was initially denied. I think they told her she had to serve until she was 50 years old. And because there's been such continued advocacy from Black women in particular, she was eventually granted clemency and was released at the end of last year. But she has a lot of great interviews available online. So I would definitely recommend looking into them. But she's not the only Black girl who's been trafficked that this is happening to. There's a girl named Crystal you can look up who was, I think, just released. And there are many, many, many others who don't have a voice. So this is not something that is unique to her case. It happens everywhere. Next slide. Who's heard about the missing girls in DC? Just give a thumbs up if you've heard. So these stories in particular are really interesting because the whole reason folks even started hearing about missing girls in DC was because a news report came out that had some inaccurate numbers. And so the DC government responded by saying, hey, the numbers aren't that, but they are still really high. So to date, DC has logged well over 500 cases of missing juveniles, the majority being Black and Latinx. Within a 2-week span, over 10 children of color went missing with very little media attention. According to the 2014 FBI stats, nearly 40% of all missing persons under the age of 18 were Black. Next. Natalie Wilson, the co-founder of Black and Missing Foundation, says, we noticed that a lot of African-American children that go missing are initially classified as runaways. They don't get an Amber Alert or media coverage. In 2016, an estimated 1 out of 6 endangered runaways reported to the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children were likely child sex trafficking victims. Of those, 86% were in the care of social services or the foster care system. So if we know, go back one. So if we know that all of these children, a lot of these children that are going missing were number one in the care of social services or the foster care system. We know that Black children are overrepresented in those systems. And we know that 1 out of 6 is most likely a child sex trafficking victim. Why is there no outrage for Black girls that go missing? Why is there no outrage for Black children that are going missing? Next. In 2016, Oklahoma City police officer Daniel Holtzclaw was convicted of 18 out of 36 counts, including 4 counts of first-degree rape, 4 counts of forced oral sodomy, after preying on African-American women over a 6-month span the year prior. Holtzclaw intentionally chose one of the city's poorest neighborhoods to prey on women in the community, with the assumption that the victim's drug or prostitution records would undermine any investigation or claims against him. 13 of his victims testified against him and ranged in age from a 17-year-old girl to a 57-year-old grandmother. One 24-year-old victim who had been intoxicated when Holtzclaw had arrested her testified that he had transported her to the hospital for detox with the promise that he would drop the charges. But as she was handcuffed, laying in her hospital bed, he raped her. And then after he raped her, he continued to stalk her, to harass her, and used the surveillance he had available to him by the police department to do so. And again, this case got very little media attention, but he was actually convicted of 18 of the 36 counts, and it was a major win for Black women, and in particular, Black sex workers or folks presumed to be sex workers, whose violence typically goes unaddressed. And then the truth about work, labor, and government handouts, just very quickly, I just want to be clear, this is something I do not argue. Black women have always worked. Black women have never been allowed to just be lazy, as a stereotype would have you believe. Black women, whether they were working as a maid, as a nanny, on the plantation, have always worked. So when we talk about welfare and housing and work, a lot comes up. A lot of people talk about how the breakdown of the traditional family structure is the root cause of Black poverty. But when you really think about the historical construct or the historical context around the Black family, Black families have never been allowed to be quote unquote traditional. And with that explanation, we're not only placing blame on Black families for their oppression and poverty, we're overlooking the historical context of Black women workers and the impact of government programs and the welfare system in particular on Black families. Until 1968, the nation's primary welfare program, which was called Aid to Families with Dependent Children, routinely denied benefits to families if an adult male was in the house. They would routinely conduct midnight raids, man of the house rules, and would terminate benefits if they found a Black man or a Black father in the home. With continued discriminatory housing and employment practices as well, Black men were further forced out of the home in order to maintain work or find affordable housing, which further pushed Black women into the role of family breadwinner or family head of household. And there's also so much more stigma attached to Black mothers than there is against white mothers. Real estate agents, for example, as a form of what's called block busting, would hire Black folks from the projects, from the ghetto, to walk up and down the street in mixed neighborhoods to encourage white homeowners to move out of the city and into the suburbs, while then preventing Black homeowners from leaving the city with things like redlining. So ghettos were intentionally created in American society. People don't like to think of it that way, or to think of the word that way, as it because it is so related to the Holocaust. But a lot of the same atrocities were happening. So if we have a fuller discussion, we'll really get to understand the reality of Black folk and how we've been forced to live, or have decided to live, and why certain areas are still predominantly Black or have historically been Black. Next. Oh, actually, no, yeah. And so we're going to talk about some popular narratives about Black women and how that's linked to our history in the now and how it shows up in the now. So next slide. So racialized sexual tropes emerged during the slave era and have continued to be perpetuated and passed down from generation to generation. We've seen a lot of these tropes evolve, but at the roots, we see where they come from. So we have the myth of the matriarch, the mammy, and the Jezebel images, all coming directly out of slavery. The matriarch was seen as overbearing, drove men away, as a workhorse, who could reproduce but wasn't desirable. We see the mammy imagery. So think Shirley Temple era. That's always something that comes to mind for me. She was supposed to be the happy slave, loved to serve, happy with her station in life, and was asexual. And then we have the Jezebel, who I always think of as Carmen Jones imagery. She was seen as hypersexual, sexually available and indiscriminate, flirtatious. And so whatever violence that was enacted upon her was her own fault because she overstepped. And so images of the welfare queen, the sapphire, the Black superwoman all came later, closer to the civil rights movement and the war on drugs. The welfare queen was seen as lazy, scamming the system, doesn't want to work, and as a baby machine. So if you've seen the movie Precious or read the book, that's Monique's character. The sapphire, she is the neo-Jezebel image. She's loud, angry, exploits men for money. The gold digger imagery, that's definitely Felicia from Friday. If you've ever seen that, by Felicia, that's where that comes from. And then we have the superwoman, who she's seen as can, will, and wants to do it all by herself. She doesn't need anybody to help her. She doesn't need a partner. She'll just handle it because she's strong like that. And sometimes that can be great to be seen as a superwoman, but it doesn't allow folks to see the complexity of who you are. And when you're actually needing help, will overlook that because they think you can just handle it. And so when we think about these racialized sexual tropes, we have to think about body politics, our history with body politics, and then how these tropes have been reinforced. Next. So I like to call this the Black woman child. It's really speaking to the fact that Black girls in particular are not thought of as little girls. They're thought of as little women. So a report came out that was phenomenal. It's entitled Girlhood Interrupted, the Erasure of Black Girls' Childhood. It was produced by Georgetown Law, the Center of Poverty and Inequality. So this study provided really for the first time data showing that adults view Black girls as less innocent and more adult-like than their white peers, especially in the age range of 5 to 14. And they actually redid this study, and now it's beginning as early as age 3 that Black girls are seen as less innocent and more adult-like. Next. So again, beginning now at age 3, Black girls are thought of in the following ways: as needing less nurturing, as needing less protection, to be supported less, to be comforted less, as more independent, as knowing more about adult topics, and knowing more about sex. And I don't know how any of those things could be true if they're 3. Why would they know all of these things compared to their peers? So there's a quote, there's a meme here that says, Black girls are regularly blamed for experiencing puberty early as if the presence of her body alone is consent. Hashtag fast-tailed girls. Because a lot of times little Black girls are called fast, even when they're not, because again, we see how these perceptions of Black girls are showing up. And so what all these perceptions do is then leave Black girls vulnerable to folks who will try to groom them or will prey on them. And they may not have support in their community or in their school to be able to speak to those issues. Next. And so with all that being said, though, I just want to make sure that we all understand Black women have been fighting for ourselves and for other women of color for a long time. With the emergence of womanism and third wave feminism, we've really been able to push back against misogynoir and misogyny. And we've really been able to celebrate difference and how it shows up for Black women. So womanism is really a direct response to the first and second wave feminist movements, where even in those movements, Black women were still told, oh, march in the back of the line. Or Black women were still told, yeah, we're fighting for voting rights, but not for y'all, not yet. Or being told, yes, we're all the same, we all need the same things, even though Black women were saying, well, we would love to feel the same, but that's not our reality, and we may need different things. Womanism was actively working against eugenics. Eugenics is the science, quote unquote, of improving human population through controlled breeding. Some well-known eugenicists from the first wave movement are Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Margaret Sanger, who's known as the founder of Planned Parenthood. So again, you can have great things on one hand and still dark histories on the other. It was definitely a recognition of intersectionality and that language. So how race, class, and genders, for instance, intersect in Black women's lives. And you can't just piece apart all of those things because they're intimately connected. It was definitely exploring representation and agency and what that means for Black women. It was a celebration of diversity, and also very clearly saying we have to bring Black men and boys along in this conversation and in this fight to end violence against women as well. So Alice Walker says, womanist is to feminist as purple is to lavender. They go hand in hand. And next. So some stats that I think are important to highlight as well. 41% of Black women have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner during their lifetimes. Most African American and Afro-Caribbean women have experienced lifetime intimate partner abuse, reported physical and psychological abuse at 31%, and a combination of psychological, sexual, and physical abuse at 30%. According to the CDC, Black women and American Indian or Native Alaskan women experienced the highest rates of homicide, and over half of all homicides were related to IPV. Next. The average age of Black female homicide victims is 5 years younger than the average age of other women. That makes you think, why are Black women dying earlier and at higher rates? Does it have something to do with help seeking or believability and why folks are turned away? 43% of domestic violence survivors arrested along with their abusive partners or as a result of complaints lodged by their abusive partners were living below the poverty line. 66% were Black or Latina. And Black women ages 25 to 29 are 11 times more likely as white women in the same age group to be murdered while pregnant or in the first year after birth. Next. So with that being said, we really have to think about what barriers are still present for Black women to get help, Black women and girls to get help. And next. And before we really delve into privilege and power and identity, we have to acknowledge how these different things are connected and how identities are connected to systems typically. So let's start with this. Who is the most normalized person in our society? What do they look like? Who are they? And feel free to use the chat. So white, middle class, heterosexual, able-bodied. What else? Middle class with a family. What else? Educated. English as a first language. Absolutely. What else? Christian, masculine. What else? Cisgender. Yep. Okay, and so if that's the most normalized person, how are those norms maintained? Through what? Social media, through different systems. Give me more about that. Law, violence, the news, othering, policies, criminal justice system, and the administration, fat shaming, transphobia, sexism, racism, right? And so if those are the way the norms are maintained, what's the connection to systems? How in society might certain systems be more oppressive to certain identities than others? So someone said the criminal justice system. How might that be oppressive to someone? A Black person. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Systems are designed to maintain power and control of the most normalized. What else? Over criminalization, criminalization of poverty. I love that. What else? What other systems might be connected to someone's identity or impact someone's identity? What about the education system? The fact that certain schools don't have heat and books, but children are supposed to learn? What about the economy? The healthcare system? The criminalization of survival? The overbearing police presence in school? Absolutely. I remember growing up, I'm from Baltimore, and there was a policy that kids had to wear plastic backpacks, see-through backpacks. So that's already telling you before you even walk into the school that you're a criminal, that they think you're trying to hide something. Stereotypes of Black men deeming them as thugs or criminals. Absolutely. Overrepresentation of Black trans folks in the criminal system. And legislation as well. The fact that anti-lynching legislation is not on the books says something. And so when we talk about privilege, we talk about systems, we also have to talk about privilege. And I find that, not surprisingly, a lot of folks have a misunderstanding of what privilege actually is and what it actually means. So next slide, Sahida. So privilege is the unearned special right, advantage, benefit, or favor granted to and or enjoyed by an individual or specific group of people. Two big reminders. Having privilege does not mean that an individual will not or has not experienced hardship. And all people are both privileged and non-privileged in certain aspects of their lives. Next. So there are a ton of different types of privileges that we could talk through, but again, I'm not gonna do that to y'all. We're just gonna go over a couple different examples. One of the easiest I find for us to start with is male privilege. So male privilege is a set of advantages and benefits that are given to men as a class due to their institutional power in relation to women. Big reminder, every man benefits from male privilege in our society, but every man also experiences privilege differently due to his intersecting identities, other forms of privilege and oppression, and the social capital that he holds in our society. So how might two men experience privilege differently? Come on, folks. How might two men experience privilege differently in our society? So based on race, absolutely. What else?
What about education?
Education. Tell me more about that.
Because one man, because he has a degree, will experience privilege in the workplace than another man who may have more he may understand the job better, but he doesn't have the proper education. But he
Yeah.
has the training. That's what I wanted to say. He has the training.
Yep. What else? So someone said sexuality. Tell me about that, Renisha. How might two men experience experience privilege based on their sexuality? So income is another thing that comes up. Lack of resources, social capital, family status. So that's class, again, shows up a lot. So let's think about this on a societal level. Let's go to the next slide. So on a societal level, men have privilege in the following ways, and many more, but these are just a couple examples. So men can dominate a conversation without being judged or being labeled as too talkative. Men get paid more than women. If you look into the wage gap and the wage gap for women of color in particular, you'll see that Black women are nowhere near on par with white men. Men are allowed to take up more physical space. It's a lot of times called manspreading. So it's when you're sitting on the bus or you're sitting next to somebody, you're sitting next to a man and he has his legs really spread out wide open. And you sort of have to cram into the corner to fit into the chair. That's manspreading. I've had men push back and say, well, I'm a big man, I need a lot of space. And to that I say, I'm a big woman, I'm still expected to close my legs. Being able to walk down the street without being told to smile, be harassed, grabbed, or catcalled. I've never heard a man tell another man to smile. You can live as a bachelor or decide not to have children without being told that they're going against their natural instincts. And men are typically encouraged to sow their wild oats or to have multiple sex partners before settling down and aren't slut shamed for it. What else? Any other examples? Yeah, men are allowed to be assertive, but women who are assertive are labeled a problem, or they're told they're power tripping. What else? Men are allowed to be more career focused, and it's not seen as a problem. They're supposed to be the providers. What happened with T.I. and his daughter, the fact that he thought he was protecting her, which you could see some of the thought process, but even the lack of understanding about women's bodies and sexuality was problematic to begin with. What else? Men holding the door for women. How's that privilege? I like what Serena said, boys will be boys. So if boys are acting violently or boys are acting in a way that's inappropriate, it's just accepted as something that boys do. So a lack of accountability there. So how might male privilege show up in terms of domestic violence? How does male privilege show up in domestic violence?
And sometimes it shows up in access to resources. If the incident goes to trial, having access to legal representation or money to pay bail or child support or any of those things. So that access to resources can make a big difference.
Great, thank you. Autumn said police respond to the men, don't necessarily listen to the women. What else? And hint, hint, it's right on that power and control wheel that we love so much as advocates, right? Next slide, Sahida. So treating their partner as a servant, being the one to make all the big decisions, acting like the master of the castle, so what I say goes, being the one to define men's and women's roles and then enact the punishment when you don't fit those guidelines. And then this is something I've seen from a lot of advocates, unfortunately, but placing all of the responsibility for protecting the children on the mothers instead of on both parents. Victim blaming, absolutely. Oh, Whitney, that was a good one. So privilege is, and this sort of goes with the boys will be boys, but little girls being told if a boy hits you, he likes you. It's just a love tap. And next slide. So I think imagery is really important to how it shapes narratives as well. So if you just type in male privilege, some interesting things will come up in your Google search, I'm sure. But there's this meme here that says, let's be honest, if Sandra Bland had a husband, she would probably be alive today. Marriage matters. Who's your protector? No, I'm pretty sure they may have both been dead if her husband had been there or if she had a husband. That's not going to protect you. Your male is not going to protect you in those circumstances. Say her name, the fact that Black women and girls are killed at very high rates by the police as well, but are largely erased from the narrative. This bottom one here, Erica made a post about mansplaining. That's what was happening here, where he was trying to tell them, this bottom one, that no, women do like to be catcalled. That's why you all go out. It's like, no, I'm just trying to go to the grocery store, actually. And then everybody remember what happened with Janet and JT? We're at the Super Bowl. He ripped her top off at the end of the song, and she was basically blacklisted, and he just performed a couple years ago. Next. What about white privilege? So white privilege is the unearned institutional advantages and benefits given to white people by virtue of a system that has established whiteness as the norm and most esteemed. Two big reminders: pointing out white privilege is not reverse racism. We're talking about systemic privilege here. We're not talking about individual privileges. And then pointing out white privilege is not about being held responsible for what your ancestors did. It's more about understanding that systems have been set up to benefit certain folks over others, and those systems are still in place. So next. Oh, I also wanted to mention that white privilege doesn't just exist between white folk and Black folk, or white folk and other people of color. There's a thing called colorism that exists in communities of color, where folks who are lighter skinned are still more esteemed than folks who are darker skinned. So I wanted to be very clear about that as well. Oh, go back one. Thank you. So on a societal level, we'll see white privilege show up in some interesting ways as well. Being able to say things like, I don't see race, or that they're colorblind, or saying all lives matter in response to certain movements, or that you're tired of talking about race. How convenient for you. I don't have the luxury of not talking about it because I may be killed walking down the street, right? Having your history taught as a core curriculum, while other histories are either silenced or taught as an elective. This is literally why we have Africana Studies, because we didn't learn about Black history outside of Black History Month, and even then it was regulated to Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X, sometimes. I don't think I ever learned anything about Asian Pacific Islander history in school, never. Being able to use a flesh tone bandage or foundation that more or less matches your skin tone. So before Rihanna put out Fenty Beauty, people were not checking for the dark skinned girls. People were not checking for albino girls, right? It was very limited what was available. But now, because they saw how much revenue she was getting from this extended line, now everybody's jumped on the bandwagon. So I had someone push back to say, well, it's just a Band-Aid. What does it matter if it says flesh tone or not? It matters because it's about representation. So if I walk into the store, I'm looking for a Band-Aid, I see flesh tone, but it's several shades lighter than what my flesh tone is. To me, that says this product is not actually for you. To me, it says you're not actually thought of or represented here. Being able to go shopping alone and be more or less certain that you won't be followed or harassed. Being able to talk about racism without being seen as self-interested or self-seeking. I've never heard one of my white ally friends been told they're playing the race card. That doesn't happen. Being able to be late for a meeting or without having that lateness be reflected on your race. And being able to fall asleep in your college dorm room without having the police called on you for trespassing. Any other examples anyone wants to give? So how does it show up in domestic violence, white privilege? Give me some examples. Next slide. So when you have white privilege, anger is seen as a result of trauma and not based on stereotypes. You're more likely to be believed as the true victim by police and advocates alike. So you're less likely to have CPS called on you, even when you go into shelter for support. Telling a Black survivor she has to call the police when that's not necessarily the option that's given to others. Not having your immigration status questioned upon entering shelter or when applying for services and housing. Your substance use is acknowledged as a coping mechanism instead of just the stereotype that you're a drug user or a drug seeker. And being able to interact with staff and upper level management who more or less look like you. So a lot of shelter programs, because that's where I come from, shelter background, a lot of shelter programs have women of color working, but are largely not upper level management. So when folks say, I need to speak to the manager, I really need to talk about this issue, and they have to go in and might deal with implicit bias, that's not actually supportive for folks. If the victim survivor has, if the victim survivor says that they were, or if they are arrested too, it's not taken seriously. They're not thought of legitimately needing housing. If their criminal record isn't taken seriously. This is something that's really problematic that actually a lot of shelters will, in their initial screening process, be screening folks out before they can even get the shelter by looking up their criminal record on things like judiciary case search. So that's implicit bias because it's not accounting for, yeah, they may have stolen, but it may have been to feed their baby. Yeah, they may have, a trespassing charge, but it could have been a racialized incident, or it could have been their partner, putting this claim out on them. So to screen folks out like that before you've even given them the opportunity when they are seeking help is gonna impact them. It's gonna impact the larger community as well, because we talk to each other. We're gonna say, yeah, don't go to that program because they're gonna call CPS on you. Or yeah, don't go to that program because they're gonna look up your criminal history and they're gonna think you stole even though it was a person in the other room. Oh, yeah, when trauma responses aren't seen as trauma responses. So fight, flight, or freeze, those usually aren't taken into account. And when they are, they're usually doubled down with those racialized tropes that we've seen. All right, next slide. So again, imagery is important. Saying things like, I don't see race, translation, I'm going to use my place of privilege to refute and deny the sufferings of those who don't have it. The fact that in places like Walmart and really anywhere that was selling hair supplies, we used to have the little half shelf of ethnic hair supplies. It's extended now because we have the extended lines, but even still, products are routinely kept under lock and key by management, so you just can't get in and grab it off the shelf. Saying things like Black names are weird or ghetto, maybe it's a problem, maybe it's your implicit bias there. Because if we can say, Dostoevsky and all these other Russian names and all these other, scholarly folks, if we can say those names, but you can't say LaQuisha, that's a problem. And things like saying like, gentrifying hairstyles even, Kim Kardashian boxer braids, no, those are cornrows. We've been wearing those for a long time. It just wasn't seen as classy until she did it, and that's a problem. Next slide. We have heterosexual privilege as well. So the unearned advantages afforded to straight cisgender people, largely based on heteronormative or heterosexist ideology. Heteronormativity is the belief that people fall into distinct and complementary genders of either male or female, or gay or straight. It's not recognizing that there's a spectrum of those things. Big reminder, heterosexual privilege not only reinforces the gender binary patriarchal gender norms and upholds the notion of deviant sexuality is largely rooted in colonialism. Next. So on a societal level, straight people aren't expected to come out. I know I was never asked, when did you decide you were straight? Straight people are not accused of being abused, warped, or psychologically confused because of their sexual orientation. Straight people aren't asked to speak for all other straight people. Straight people can be open about their sexual orientation and romantic relationships without worrying about losing their jobs. And straight people can be sure that when they watch TV or read a magazine, that there's someone from their sexual orientation is represented. And I've heard people push back on that as well. Well, there's a lot of things on TV I don't identify with. But the reality is you can most likely change the channel and find a character that you can identify with that doesn't fall into a trope. Next. In domestic violence, this shows up where in heterosexual relationships, your partner can't threaten to out you as a form of control. And why is outing so important? Why do we really have to focus in on that? Because it can mean life or death for people. If you're outed, if you're in a community that's not accepting or a family that's not accepting, you could be killed for being who you are. So when you have heterosexual privilege, there is a shelter in every state that will house you for domestic violence, and you can be assured that you'll more or less feel physically safe when entering shelter. A lot of folks in the LGBTQ community are sometimes, or trans people in particular, I'm thinking, are told to go to homeless shelter, where that's not safe either, and they're very prone to violence there. Outing trans people can get them fired, absolutely. Someone can lose their job, faith, church home. Outing is a form of violence. There's less likelihood of being questioned as the primary aggressor or seen as mutually combative in an abusive relationship when you have straight privilege. So there's this narrative that if two gay men are in a relationship, they're both equally violent towards each other. And that's not true, because we know there's a predominant aggressor in domestic violence relationships, even when the other person fights back, right? We know that. And advocates and law enforcement personnel will not inaccurately assume the gender or pronouns of your partner or yourself when doing intake or when providing services. How else does it show up? Or how else may it show up? What about threats around parenting? So a lot of partners, especially if they're straight presenting, will say, or if they are the biological parent, will say, well, I'm the bio parent. You're never going to get custody. You're never going to see your kid again if you leave me. Or I'm the more stable looking one. The judge isn't going to believe you and they're going to give me the kid. What else? Any other examples? Next slide. So with heterosexual privilege and really around transphobia, you'll hear things like Black trans women being told you'll never be a real woman. There's this constant discussion of the homosexual agenda, which is just like have a family, buy milk, fight for equality. There's a conversation in the LGBTQ community around whether or not the brown and Black stripe should be added to the flag, which is like, why wouldn't you if you're an inclusive community, right? So folks are still left out even within community. And then when we think about safety, either I can affirm myself and possibly be violated, or I cannot affirm myself and still possibly be violated. Those are really hard choices to make, which is right? Next. And the last form of privilege we'll talk about is class privilege. Class privilege is the advantage of being afforded a higher social ranking based on income, wealth, education, status, position, and power. Class privilege is not solely based on economic capital, but is influenced by social and cultural capital as well. So what do I mean by social and cultural capital? Any guesses? So what I mean by that is you can have two Black men, right? Two Black men. One is Harvard educated. No. One has some college education. One is an NBA player. The NBA player is going to have more social capital than the other person. Next slide. So on a societal level, you'll see class privilege in being gifted with a car at age 16. You haven't necessarily done anything to get that car, but if the expectation is, yeah, I'm gonna get that car when I turn 16, you might have some class privilege. Not that your parents haven't worked hard for it, not that you may have, not saved up for that, but there's a lot of class privilege that goes into it because a lot of folks are still riding the bus. Not having to worry about being able to afford college. So if that was never a thought, you may have some class privilege. Being able to afford a nanny or childcare and not having to rely on the eldest child to take on the caregiving role for younger siblings. Being able to swear or even commit a crime without people attributing it to the low morals of your class. Large families are celebrated. So we had John and Kate +8. We had the Duggars, 19 kids or 20 kids, 19 kids and counting, right? They got TV shows. What happened to Nadia Schulman? Octomom, if you don't know her name, right? Because she was never really given a name in media. She was called Octomom, right? Because she was too brown and too poor to have all those kids. Having access to healthy food options in your own neighborhood. So food deserts are very real, especially for urban communities. So not only do you have to get on the bus to go to the grocery store that's outside of your community to be able to afford the groceries there, you have to take your 6 kids and then get back with all those groceries and your kids, right? That's really hard for folks. And then choosing to wear secondhand clothing. So I love a good deal. I love a good thrift store, but those aren't my only options. So not recognizing that for some folks that is their only option would be a class privilege that I would have. How might class privilege show up in DV, in domestic violence? I think it might have been Sarah that said being able to afford a private attorney. Yeah, what else? Let's go to the next slide. So being seen as needing temporary relief instead of being seen as scamming the system when applying for benefits. Being seen as more honest because you come from a good background or good neighborhood. The ability to afford a private attorney and not having to rely on a public defender or pro bono attorney to accept your case. So I want to be clear. I know a lot of public defenders. I have great friends that do pro bono work as well, but their wait lists are immense. And it's really hard to get someone to take your case on for free. CPS is more likely to be called on lower socioeconomic folks in DV situations. Not needing shelter or having other housing options, that's definitely sometimes class privilege right there. What else? So the last one is something that I've heard, unfortunately, again, from a lot of advocates. And that comes into the shaming aspect of it. Shaming a victim who chooses not to leave their relationship or leave the home by saying things like, I'd rather be homeless than abused. Well, if homelessness is on the horizon for you, it's far safer a lot of times to stay with your abusive partner because you can at least manage them, or you at least know their signs and their triggers, or you at least know what to look out for and maybe can do some safety planning around it. But instead, you want me to go out with my children and be on the street homeless or be in shelter where I can't control things myself? That's class privilege. Not being able to make bail can leave you incarcerated, creating more barriers to your physical and mental health to present to court. Absolutely. So a lot of folks are in jail simply because they couldn't afford their bail. There are fewer resources geared towards your needs, or there are more resources geared towards your needs. May have friends, family support, right? A lot of folks with class privilege, you may not have to go to shelter because you may have that credit card in your hand that you can buy a hotel room for the night or for the week. Next. And again, imagery is so important to narratives and how they're shaped. There's this meme, I don't know if anybody saw, there was a series of memes about Kermit the Frog. And he was saying some very spicy things, but saying things like, I saw you pull a food stamps card out your Gucci bag, but that's none of my business. That's shaming because number one, you don't know if that Gucci bag is real. You don't know if they saved up for a year to buy that bag. You don't know if it was a gift. Because they're poor, they shouldn't have nice things. Because they are on food stamps, they shouldn't be able to buy their kids a nice meal or celebrate their birthdays. 200 per kids, y'all have more. That feeds into the welfare queen narrative that Black women in particular just want to have all these babies because they're getting all this government assistance. It's really expensive to have kids out here. This little bit of government assistance people are getting is not the reason they're having children. We see the responses in the opioid versus crack epidemics, right? Not that both sides didn't need help, but we see drastic differences in how they've been addressed. And then that sweater down there, that's from the Yeezy collection, Kanye West's collection. That sweater cost $1,300. That's a mortgage payment, right? But if someone were actually homeless and actually wearing that sweater, they'd be invisible. Judging someone on their getting their hair or nails done, but who also need shelter or assistance. This is something that's important as well. A lot of folks think that because you're poor or because you're technically homeless means you shouldn't be able to do some self-care. That's self-care. Taking care of yourself. That's also how people can get a job. So I'm supposed to go in, my hair not done, and apply for this job, and you think I'm going to get it? That's a setup. Hair color as well, or expectations that Black folks don't have different hair colors. Black folks don't naturally have blonde hair, so they're being told to take it out. That's an assumption. My sister has blonde hair. Next slide. And so with all this being said, it's really important to then check the power dynamics that happen between victims and advocates, or victim survivors and advocates. So big reminder, although we go into domestic violence work with best intentions, we still operate from a place of privilege and power when working with survivors. The power dynamics that come with being deemed an authority is something to pay attention to. You cannot exert power and expect to empower. Oh, I love that, Erica. So a lot of survivors are told, or survivors who do get into shelter and are starting to be more and more self-aware and self-empowered, are then told they're not humble enough, or they're asking for too much, or they're too entitled. Next slide. And this sort of takes us in the direction of talking about intersectionality. Intersectionality is a term that was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw. It's a framework that's designed to explore the dynamics between identities and connected systems of oppression. So how race, class, and gender are then connected to patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism. Next. And I have 3 quick videos that I would love to show that really speak to the notion and concept of intersectionality. They're from the Race and series by raceforward.org, put them on. You're able to find them on YouTube. I just sat one day and watched like all of them that I could because they're really great. And these are just 3 specific videos that speak to Black women intersectionality, but there are a whole bunch of different types that I would highly encourage you watching when you get a chance. So we're just gonna play these back to back, and then we can talk them through if we need to. Oh, I think Whitney was gonna help with the
Yeah, I got it.
I'm like, I keep telling everybody I'm the least tech savvy millennial out there. Like, no.
I'm Jamia Wilson, Executive Director.
in action and the media. Race and gender, race and disability, race and class. Intersectionality is something that I think about every day because I'm living it. And I also think about what it means to show up in the world in my specific body with my specific experience and background. I am African American. I'm also straight. I am able-bodied except for the fact that I was born with a visual impairment. So I walk around with a disability that sometimes people can't see. I was raised in an upper middle class background, so I have class privilege. All of those things play into power, privilege, and marginalization that I experience depending on those different aspects of my identity. Even though race is a social construct and we know that genetically there is no such thing as race, it's this very powerful, powerful illusion that's been perpetuated and used to kill people. It's been used to justify war. It's been used to enslave people. It's been used to force people into indentured servitude. And to disregard that history is disrespectful to all the people who suffered and fought for me to be able to live closer to freedom today. When I am in feminist spaces, and sometimes I might be told that it's divisive for me to bring up race, that we need to focus on the issue at hand, which is gender. Or it might come up in a space where we're doing racial justice work, and I might be told by another person of color, well, this isn't an issue about your gender, this isn't an issue about race, and it doesn't matter what the gender issue is, race has to take priority and precedence in this issue. That's impossible for me to make a prioritization of various parts of my identity that are equally integral to who I am and that are inextricably connected. We want to make sure that we're not single storying other people and that we aren't contributing to that, that people need to be able to show up as their whole selves, and that's better for us as a community and as a culture and a society. What I really want to ask people who ask me that question is, what part of your own internalized oppression or your own addiction to the drug that is privilege makes you fear full liberation for all people? There's a problem with even seeing this as divisive. There's a problem when we're not actually understanding that the liberation of all people makes us all free. When trans women of color are free, that's bringing me close to freedom. When Syrian refugees are free, that brings me close to freedom. It's really important for us to think about that, not to think about how we protect our own privilege with a structure that doesn't even work for us, but how do we create more openness and liberation for all human beings, for all humanity. My name is Ariel Newton. I am the founder of BlackMillennials.com. I'm also an organizer with Black Lives Matter New York City.
Race and religion.
Race and gender, race and sexuality. I am Black. I'm also a woman.
To affect the way that we walk through the world. I am South Asian. I also consider myself Punjabi. I am Sikh.
Sorry, y'all. Yes, it is. Good.
My name is Ariel Newton. I am the founder of BlackMillennials.com. I'm also an organizer with Black Lives Matter New York City. Race and gender, race and sexuality. I am Black. I'm also a woman. I'm also queer. That means that I have to deal with racism, patriarchy, and homophobia. We have to be comfortable and clear that we're not playing oppression Olympics. It's just recognizing that these various systems of oppression are going to work to marginalize some folks more than others.
For them, I say they are uncomfortable with the depth of existence. I think they're hiding behind their fear. I think they hide behind the fear of recognizing even when they perpetuate certain things. So, for example, white feminists get very upset when Black feminists are like, no, we're not going to be all women. We're going to say that Black women, Indigenous women are oppressed more than white women. And if you're uncomfortable with that, then that means that you're not fighting for all women to begin with. Ultimately, that's what makes our battle stronger, if we can recognize and be more comprehensive in how we go about advocating when we understand that folks are intersectional beings. Our oppression doesn't all look the same. Our oppression is determined by what we look like, what we sound like, where we grew up, where we went to school, if we went to school. And that's why it's important that as we try to dismantle oppressive systems, that we're clear that some folks are oppressed more than others. We have seen primarily, even within Black liberation struggles, some of these oppressive behaviors repeat themselves. Black women and Black transgender people are often erased and silenced, their labor co-opted by dominant heteronormative ideals. We have to unlearn these behaviors and ultimately understand that these behaviors came by way of white supremacy. So if we're clear that our oppression, the ways that we perpetuate oppression within our own community, we can better achieve racial justice. Sometimes I say that I put my Blackness before my womanhood, or I put my Blackness before my queerness, and I'm trying to unlearn that compartmentalizing of my being. My entire being is what informs how I navigate the world, how I respond to injustice, how I promote justice. It's hard for people to be complicated or to recognize complication. Folks like things easy. Today I'm going to say no more. Today I say that I am a full human being, and my humanity is wrapped up in a lot of different layers and tiers and so many different things. And that's beautiful. It should be celebrated, although it might be more difficult to understand.
And this last one, she is by far my favorite of the series. So if you see me mouthing, it's because I watched it a million times.
Lady Dane Figueroa Aditi, performance artist, goddess, ancient jazz priestess of Mother Africa. Race and gender, race and class. So I'm a Black, Indigenous, Cuban, Nigerian, American woman who's trans. I'm the daughter of an immigrant. I come from the ghettos of Baltimore. People have to understand what all of the histories of all of those identities in order to understand really my positionality within the world. There are poor Black people, there are rich Black people, there are Black cis women, there are Black trans women. And so intersectionality is telling us that we have to discuss race in particular, right? Like, because that's the topic that I'm using. Like, if we're talking about race, that we have to talk about it in its full scope. Yes, we are sharing an experience because, for example, two Black people, we are sharing this experience because we're both Black. But I'm a Black trans woman. And so numbers don't lie, and we all know that Black trans women in particular are some of the most marginalized in our community and the most affected by structural oppression. There's this concept that we are all given the same opportunities, but it's not true. If we look historically and we talk about, you know, this idea of pulling yourself up by the bootstraps, Black people actually did pull themselves up by their bootstraps. But we then have places like Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. There was thriving Black neighborhoods, Black people buying from Black businesses, owning Black businesses, investing in Black businesses. Right? And that's what they're told. All you have to do is be rich and nobody can ever hurt you again. All you have to do is buy into the system and move upward and you'll be safe. What then happened was their white neighbors would then come and literally commit acts of genocide. And so now today, right, we have people who could have had old money who are now poor. And so what is that psychologically saying to these people? That when you thrive, when you succeed, you're still not safe. And so we're talking about race and class, and we're not understanding the history of race and class as it presents itself in America in particular, because that's where we're living, right? And we're having a fool's conversation. If someone comes to me and they say to me, you are creating differences, I would say, no, that's actually not true. Because in my indigenous cultures, people who were different were still essential to society. Within European cultures, particularly within the rise of patriarchy and the way that it manifests through religion, is that differences little by little were no longer celebrated and they were stamped out. And the one thing that structural oppression gives us that we should all aspire to generally is of a cis, het, white man. So when we're talking about intersectionality, right, I'm always being an intersectional being because I'm all of these things always at once. If you're having a conversation with me and you're not having a conversation understanding that I come with all of those identities within the conversation, then how are we supposed to move forward?
Thanks, Whitney. Mm-hmm. And Zahida, we can just go back to the slides really quickly. And next slide. And so I want to just very quickly talk through some of the protective strategies that we in the Black community have employed, because we have many. But there have been some unintentional consequences or unintentional impacts of those protective strategies. Next slide. So the first is respectability politics. Someone mentioned in the comments the politics around hair. The fact that I could be fired from a job for having natural hair, having locks, is an issue. It's gonna create a larger pay gap for a lot of folks. There's also, someone also made the comment about nails and hair. It is a self-care practice. It is a STEAM practice. Tattoos as well. Thank you, Deborah. Dress and decor. My grandma will always say, just because you're poor doesn't mean you have to look poor. So people should still be able to have pride in themselves, even when they're going through some things. The mask and code switching, which Umi talked, wearing lashes. Yes, this make you feel great. I love a good lash. Code switching. So having or being put in situations where you can't feel authentically you because you may not be deemed as appropriate or professional or educated enough. So you have to switch up how you speak, and you have to switch up how you engage with folks. And then the pressure of racial uplift. So there is a lot of pressure that goes into making sure that the Black community is held in a good light, because there's so many obstacles, there's so many barriers, there's so many different tropes that already exist, so many stereotypes that already exist about Black people. We want to make sure that we're not giving folks extra reasons to basically hate us or to hate on us. Next slide. And then the code of silence. So this really came out of, again, that same mentality of don't give folks extra reasons to be violent towards us. So no snitching as a concept is really based a lot of times in community where you don't tell in your own community. You either handle it internally or it gets buried. Racial loyalty. Are you really going to put another Black man in jail? Are you really going to have another Black mother be separated from her children? Why are you exposing yourself to these things? You need to be loyal to your community. That's a narrative that's pushed a lot of times. Code of silence is really a lot of times a protection from state sanctioned violence. So I'm not going to go out seeking the police when they just, did this to our community, or we have a sordid history with the police in our community. Insulation equals survival for a long time. We stay to ourselves, we stay unseen, we stay unheard, and we're surviving the way we know best how. The impact of mass incarceration. Again, I'm not going to put another Black person in jail. We're overrepresented. I need my family intact as best as possible. And then the impact of carceral feminism and punishment as well, where we talked again how different interests were put forward during the first and second wave feminist movement. We had white feminists saying, no, if we lock folks up, people will be safe, survivors will be safe. But we had a lot of Black advocates saying, yes, we could lock people up, but maybe that's not the best option. Yes, we could lock people up, but what's going to happen to this family where the dad was the primary provider, or the dad was the one able to really go out and work, or the mother may have had to stay home, or the children may have stayed home. Next slide. Oh, thank you, Rose. Rose had a comment that when Anita Hill spoke up, there was a lot of backlash against her for potentially preventing a Black man from reaching his position of power. So again, being told you have to prioritize for the good of the community over your own personal safety or over your own personal experience. Erica said, as an advocate in the police department in the hardest area of Detroit, highest DV and violence rates, refused to wear a suit and dress shoes and sit across a desk from a survivor. Rearranged my office so I could sit across from the person. And I wore jeans to create a system instead of requesting the advocate just ask for Erica. That's absolutely true. It happens in shelter all the time. Why am I wearing quote unquote professional clothes and slacks when I may be working with someone who cannot nearly afford that? It's not to say that you can't wear nice clothes or you can't have nice bags and nice cars, but you also have to then understand someone's perception of you is going to be impacted by the way you show up for them. Yeah, people want to know that you're a person. People want to know that you care about their experience. People want to know that you're not just looking down on them because you have this status. A lot of survivors in shelter would say, yeah, you care because you're here, but you're going to go home at the end of the day. And it was absolutely true. You do have class privilege a lot of times working in shelters. Next, we're on this one. So some other key concepts that I think are really important to think about, again, anger and how it's perceived. Black women have a lot of reasons to be angry, and they're very justified. So however we express our anger, take yourself out of it. It's not about you being a bad advocate, or it's not about your program necessarily. It's not just that. It's all these other layers of violence that we're already dealing with. Mental health and trauma. So in the Black community, there is a saying, we don't go to therapy, we go to church, because therapy was a lot of times, and because of the historical context of basically being forced into institutions or forced to engage with institutions, a lot of folks are distrustful of therapists and of the mental health care system. But that's slowly but surely changing. It's becoming more accepted. But even still, mental health is not really seen in its full scope in the Black community. We talked about carceral punishment and the push to lock up abusive partners. Motherhood, we've talked about, and the fact that Black mothers aren't given the same grace that white mothers are oftentimes given. Trust and rapport, that's something important as well. We could have a great rapport. A lot of survivors have had a great rapport with advocates and not trusted them a lick, because they've had to learn how to negotiate you. They've had to observe and then tailor their own behavior. They've had to code switch to get what they need from you, and that's survival. Colorism, again, we see it happen in communities of color, where folks of lighter skin tone are more esteemed or more accepted or more valued than folks with darker skin, and that plays into mental health. That plays into seeking and being granted services. The victim, survivor, true survivor. Black women are not seen as true survivors oftentimes, because, again, of those tropes that exist where we're seen as, oh, you must have done something. Oh, you might have been too angry. You caused the problem. Fear is very valid. If I don't know what's going to happen when I go to shelter, I just know what I've heard. I just know what other people have experienced. I might not go. I might be afraid to be alone. I might be afraid to seek services because my partner says they're going to kill me. All of those things are very valid reasons why someone may be fearful. Representation, and then Eurocentric standards of beauty and the impact that has on Black women as well. I think it's really important to have all of these conversations. Again, thinking about intersectionality, thinking about privilege, thinking about power and how it shows up to really be able to help someone when they're in need and when they're seeking services. Next slide. And then this last one here, I found this on Facebook and I just loved it because I think it really speaks to how these issues are so connected. So I'll just read it for you and then I'll hand it back over to the team. Health insurance is a mental health issue. I can't help a client who can't afford to see me. Housing is a mental health issue. I can't use therapy to help a client whose depression and anxiety come directly from sleeping in the streets. Food insecurity is a mental health issue. I can't help a client who isn't taking their medication because their pills they take with food and they have nothing to eat. Healthcare is a mental health issue. I can't help a client whose depression is actually a thyroid condition they can't afford to get treated. Wages are a mental health issue. I can't help a client whose anxiety comes from the fact that they're one missed shift away from not being able to make rent. Childcare is a mental health issue. I can't help a client who works 80 hours per week to afford daycare and doesn't have time or energy left to come see me. Drug policing is a mental health issue. I can't help a client who ended up in prison because they got caught self-medicating with illegal substances. Police brutality is a mental health issue. I can't help a client whose anxiety is very, very real and justified fear of ending up as a hashtag. If you're going to take a stand for improving mental health, you have to understand that addressing mental health goes way beyond hiring more therapists and talking more about mental health on social media. If we're really serious about tackling mental health problems as a country, it means rolling up our sleeves and taking down the barriers that prevent people from seeking and getting the help they need, even if those people are different from us, lead different lives, and make choices we don't agree with. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to the team. Thank you all so much.
Thanks, Ayana. Thank you so much for that presentation. It's so important that you have highlighted so many critical issues for our community, and particularly for Black women and Black survivors. Identifying and lifting up the need for mental health response and specific trauma-related responses for our community. The fact that anger, Black women's anger is absolutely justifiable and important for us to recognize and to think through. The ideas around carceral punishment, our very real fear, living lives in this country and addressing living through racism and systemic oppression. And then also representation, whether it's in standards of beauty, in policymakers and legislation, and in the systems that we seek to serve. So with that, I think it's a perfect place to end for today, because tomorrow we will be discussing a lot of the things that Ayana talked about and that Umi addressed in her first presentation around systems of oppression and systems of racism and how they impact our services. But tomorrow will really be about how do we practice, how do we put our lessons learned into practice, and really focused on developing culturally specific services, looking at how we build the infrastructure of our organizations so that we can be empowered to respond to the specific needs of our community, as both Ayana and Umi have lifted up for us today. And so you'll have presentations tomorrow from Jennifer Hooker, who is Ujima's Finance and Operations Director, around increasing our own capacity, both fiscally and organizationally, administratively. We're going to have a discussion around federal grant streams from HUD, the Housing and Urban Development, from the Office on Violence Against Women through the Violence Against Women Act, and from the Department of Health and Human Services from the Family Violence and Prevention Services Act. So you'll hear more about those grant opportunities, those funding streams, and particularly how we as culturally specific organizations can access them. And then we're going to walk through just a brief policy update. Not going to do legislative advocacy, so we can do it on our federal time, but really education around some of the policies that have come up. And this is critically important because what we know, Greta and Megan, who are our policy team, work a lot with congressional members and policy leaders, and very rarely are there folks that look like us in positions of power to make long-standing decisions around policies and how they impact us. So making sure that we are educated about policies related to violence against women, and particularly how they impact Black women and girls and the Black community, is critically important. So we'll be talking about that again tomorrow. So we look forward to you all joining us tomorrow. We hope that in the spirit of meditation that Umi brought us together with this morning, that you'll take some time to relax and breathe. You have been amazing to join us in Zoom for pretty much all day sessions. So we greatly appreciate that. Again, I want to thank Ayana and Umi for walking us through these incredible presentations today. And also thank you to Whitney and Sahida for making sure that this all happened. So we hope that you will take some time to rest this afternoon, get some good sustenance, take a moment to enjoy some of the wonderful weather, and we'll see you back here, same place, tomorrow morning. You can use the same dial-in information. Whitney, Sahida, any other logistics that they need to know for tomorrow morning?
So the dial-in information is actually different for tomorrow, but I'll
You.
send you all the information so that you have that. And tomorrow we begin at 10 a.m. Eastern, which is 9 a.m. Central.
Okay, so everyone will need to check their emails, right? You'll be sending an email message with the dial-in information. Perfect. All right, thank you, everyone. We'll talk with you tomorrow.